Good afternoon. This is John Firth with a touch of laryngitis in another installment of Firth and Friends. And today we have a little bit of a departure in that we're going to be talking about careers, not necessarily about the role of the CEO or about organizational or business issues, but you personally. How do you plan a career? Do you plan a career, and how important is it? And I'm here with my two good friends, Jonathan Phillips, who, after working at Shell, has been a executive recruiter and now a career coach for pretty much 30 years, right, Jonathan?
Oh yeah, at least that long. Feels longer some days.
And sometimes it feels like you started yesterday. And Alan Byrne, who is a professional HR executive, having led a number of HR organizations for small and medium-sized firms owned by private equity. And he's going to present what it looks like when you have an employee who has a plan, or at least thinks they have a plan, and that doesn't always necessarily jive with the organization that that person is currently employed by. So we're going to start by defining what it means to have a plan, a career plan. I'll start off and say how my career was planned very quickly. I made a decision at 28 to do my MBA because I was basically doing music and creative things in my 20s, and it was planned. I knew at some point I'd do my MBA. When I did that, I went to NYU because I thought I'd go into investment banking. I did go into investment banking, but it was in the terrible recession of 1990-91, so it was kind of boring. I went to Deutsche Bank because the plan was, I figured I had lived in Germany while I was a musician. I spoke German, and it was a fairly no-brainer to join them. There were only 800 people in North America at the time. I think there's something like 40,000 now. They had just bought a strategy consulting firm. I had no idea what that was or what the work would be, but it was highly recommended that I consider going back to Germany and working for them. And the reason why I did it was we had rotations. I rotated through the office in Munich, and they were in the middle of merging East and West Germany, so a once-in-a-lifetime historic event. And I also got in front of CEOs pretty quickly, whereas Deutsche Bank, I probably would have had to even wait a year or two before I had to see a CFO. And it was a very heady experience. And I stayed in the industry because of that, because it was exciting. And my one plan was to move up, become a partner. And that happened. I worked hard. I was lucky. I pushed the envelope a little bit hard in some cases to make it happen. And that was basically my plan. When I became that, then I wanted to become an internal consultant. I did that. It was funny how it sort of worked out the way I wanted it. And when I left that, I was first time in my life without really a plan. And I went back into consulting, and we got hit by a recession. The plan got upended again. And it so happened at that moment, I became the CEO of the Association for the Consulting Industry, which again wasn't planned, but was actually a very heady experience, and I learned a lot. After that, I made myself independent, and we'll talk about that a little later. But Jonathan, if you could tell us, in the context of your plan also, that will help us understand your background.
Yeah, without going too far back, honestly, when I went to school, I decided to study something I didn't know much about, which happened to be chemistry, and I loved it. Got out, looked at careers in chemistry, realized not for me. So I went back to school and got an engineering degree, came out again, and this time was really intrigued. I started working for Shell. I did a little work in R&D. I did some work as a process engineer. Then I decided I wanted to learn more about business. Shell gracefully paid for me to get an MBA. I got that, did a little programming on early laptops. I know you started early. I started back when there were grid laptops, which were an offshoot of our Shell story for another day. Learned to do some programming, got promoted, went to head office, and loved it. For 4 years, it was great. Did all kinds of stuff. And then after 10 years total, I realized working in a large company probably wasn't what I wanted to do long term. And we can talk a little bit about that later. I made a drastic career change by asking myself some real fundamental questions about what motivated me to get up every morning. And we can go into that maybe a little more later.
Well, give us one or two highlights. What motivates
you? So I loved working at Shell, but I realized Shell's business was not growing business. It was more to stay in business. And that was it wasn't quite scratching my entrepreneurial itch. I decided what I really wanted to do was build things, which is something I'd love to do all the way back into grade school. I just loved building things and I loved exploring. So I decided to get a job in an industry that really had no prerequisites and required very little assets, and that was the search business. Talked to a couple of people that did it, got intrigued by it, joined a firm. They did business one way. I quickly realized I wanted to do business only on a retained basis. And so I opened my own company and began doing search work. And again, I love learning. And so placing consultants was natural. Consultants are always doing things differently. They're always got sort of interesting things to talk about. Their companies are always pushing the envelope with their clients. A lot of it was, Fortune 500 stuff, which was interesting because it was global. And I just drifted into placing partners in management consulting firms. And I've done things around that ever since. And then now the career stuff happened after I wrote a book about the job market, which again, maybe we could go into a little more later, but that happened later after I'd been doing search for 25 years and realized there were some problems in it.
So was there an overarching theme or goal?
No, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of what had to change, no matter what plan I had, when you actually start doing things change. But underlying everything was my fundamental motivation to work for myself, to have a lot of fun and enjoy the kinds of conversations I was having with people, just great topics and interests. And I love growing business, not just for myself, but ultimately what I discovered was I love growing those businesses for my clients. What I learned after 25 years was, and maybe I should have caught this earlier, I also loved empowering the candidates I talked to get control of their careers, which speaks directly to having a plan. And how I view planning in a career is very different now than what I viewed planning for a career was early on.
Okay,
That's
excellent.
changed dramatically.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Alan, what about your career? Now, I know you have something in common. We all have one thing in common, is that at some point we made a somewhat dramatic shift away from what we had been doing to something new. And that's also the case with you.
Yeah, I mean, when I originally came out of school, I was kind of self-directed, I guess, and this is just honest by my parents that I was going to be a banker. I liked finance. I worked part-time in a bank, and so it just seemed like the natural thing for me to flow into. And of course, got hired right away and started at the bottom and worked my way up. And it was, every day was fun because I interacted not just with fellow employees, but the outside and customers. So I was interfacing with the clients every day. Then I saw other opportunities to strengthen my lending abilities and learn those kinds of things about, how people borrow money, why people borrow money. And then it seemed like I, in a sense, had kind of hit a wall because banking has a certain reputation for not really paying people. And I wanted to start making money.
Okay.
And so one of my employees had left and gone to a software company that was a very successful company. And she called me and she said, "There's an opening here in the HR department, and I think you should go for it." So I remember walking in, and first time that I went to an interview and didn't have a tie on, I was sitting with about being in personnel, human resources. It was myself and about 30 other women sitting in a waiting to be called, thinking to myself, what are you doing here? But I went through it, and it was about 5 interviews. I ended up getting the job. And what it did for me was help me shift like who I was, in that like I could be rigid in banking, but also now working in a software company, I was working with people who were a lot more casual, and they suddenly had these things called computers, and they were the Macs, and I'm just looking at this thing and it's looking at me, and I'm thinking to myself, somebody said, just start pushing the buttons, you can't break it. And I said, okay. So I kind of self-taught myself and worked pretty hard at that, and graduated up through that HR department. Company was eventually bought. I decided to leave and accepted a job with a startup in San Francisco. And that startup was made up of a couple of companies. And then one of the biggest investors was NBC Entertainment. So in the big picture, in the end, I ended up working for NBC Entertainment. I had an office in New York. I had one in San Francisco. I had the whole corral down in Orange County. So it was, I was working with some of the most dynamic people and watching myself grow. I was actually becoming, I would call it, more aggressive, plus in a plus way. And that I was becoming more effective in my directness with people about how to get things done. My job was growing and growing. And so, you know, I learned so much, especially working in the hysterical entertainment business.
Yeah, I was there too.
When you want to say when you want to say hysterical, it's out of control hysterical.
No.
And that's not funny. So I got a phone call, and the company, the software company I had worked for, had been acquired again. They asked if I would come back and be the VP of HR. I did. They were owned by a private equity firm who took a liking to me. And within the first 6 months, I was overseeing 5-6 other companies. And then they offered me a full-time job working in private equity. So I spent 21 years now in private equity. 15 of it was in private equity organization. And then the rest I've been on my own, doing my own thing. And my biggest talent today, I guess you could say, would be I do really well with small emerging companies that need to build their HR departments and hire the right people to off the bang so they can get going and growing. And so that's what I'm doing today.
Excellent. So if I can parse this out, I hear 4 or 5 themes that we're going to explore. One is that we all made a change somewhere in our early 20s, early to mid 30s, a fairly dramatic change, a conscious decision. Whereas what we started with may have been somewhat conscious, but could have also been more our parents pushing us than anything. We all clearly saw our career as a way to build the financial resources we needed for the lives we wanted. We also discovered that really what it's about is figuring out what you like, what you want, both in terms of career, but also the organization you work with or your own organization, and also what you're good at, what people will hire you as. And we also at some point all hit an entrepreneurial streak where we said, I'm not fully satisfied. I want to be my own boss, build something. Or in some cases we didn't really have a choice because the career options weren't there. Yeah. And finally, what really interests me is that serendipity thing. You get a call from a headhunter, or you meet someone, and next thing you know, you're going off onto a tangent that may be new, but more importantly, may be more what you should be doing than what you think you were supposed to do. So I'll take this moment just to let you know who's on the phone and how you can get in touch with him. Jonathan Phillips. He is an executive recruiter, and this is his contact information. I'll keep that up for about 6 or 7 minutes while we go to the next one. So the things I mentioned, Jonathan, what really resonated with you in terms of the change you made, how you make money and the need for money, finding out what you want or are good at, the entrepreneurial side or the serendipity of the whole prospect of building a career?
I'm actually gonna jump to serendipity, because at the time I consciously didn't try to think too much about what to do, except that I wanted to own my own business. Mm-hmm. And then when I started it, I consciously didn't try and work in any particular area. I just talked to lots of different people in lots of different professions and lots of different industries, and let myself discover what it was that resonated, what I liked. And that's how I gravitated towards placing partners in consulting and building groups. I just found the conversations fun and interesting, and it's fairly lucrative. I mean, it's fun to build things, and companies are very serious about wanting to do it. But I think serendipity is a great word because as I've gotten to know candidates, a lot of times people will get a call and they'll say, wow, this sounds great. I'm going to go do that. And serendipity is a wonderful thing if you're careful. But it turns out being careful means thinking differently about the job market separate from the career market. And so often I talk to sometimes very senior executives who take a job that just sounds great and it ends up being a disaster for lots of reasons. So what I do when I talk to people about having a plan is the reason to have a plan, fundamental reason, is you really want to think about what you want now and later, near term and long term. And you want to avoid false positives and you want to avoid false negatives. And a false positive is when you take a great job, it's terrible for your career because jobs and careers are different. A false negative, a great job comes across and you say, I'm not sure I want to do that. You don't do it and then regret it later. So serendipity is really a terrific way to begin a conversation because we've all been subject to luck, both
Right.
good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would definitely call it luck and being at the right place at the right time and picking up the phone at that moment. What about you, Alan? What of this sort of resonates with you?
Well, I think that especially in the private equity sector, what I was really learning was that there was a bigger contribution for me to make because I was working with companies that were failing and we were buying them and attempting to turn them around. And that would be by either working with the management team to redeveloping their skills, finding people that were in wrong jobs, putting them into the right jobs, kind of doing some switches. Sometimes we then would acquire companies that that we would add on to them and grow it that way. And, I was always constantly in the training mode and the fix it mode in that I would look at something so simply and say, well, why don't you just move this from the left to the right? And you've now just dropped $20,000 a month out of that category of expense. And they go, why did I never see that? I said, because you're in the thick of it every day.
Right.
And so therefore you lose your vision to it.
Right.
And it was like getting people to get back into their vision about what's important to you about your company. What do you want to bring to work every day?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what,
So, Alan, you were in an interesting position. I was often the consultant that helped HR and business leaders make the decision to cut headcounts, really dramatically alter some people's careers. How did you feel about that? What was your role when you knew you were about to change somebody's career?
Well, it's a little bit of a joke, but as I tell people, I don't lay people off. I invite them to what's next in their life.
I think that's actually a very good way of looking at it.
So what I would do is, listen, what they say is the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And I would work with executives, not just like, here's your package, let's review it, but helping them to get set up with career coaching, and maybe introducing them to some recruiters, maybe sometimes saying to them, you've made enough, go take a month off and breathe. Go think about yourself and your wife and your kids and let them get to know you again. So there was always these different types of engagements. And for me, when we would sell companies, I'd be kind of sad because I didn't get to go anymore. And my contribution was kind of like over. Mm-hmm. But people still stay in touch with me. And that's why I decided that when I looked at the economy at a certain time and businesses were crashing left and right, I was like, I can make a difference here. And I can go in, and I was working with people thought it was so unusual to have an HR person on the due diligence team. And I'm just like, yeah, I mean, because other companies, other PE firms didn't have it.
Really? That's interesting. I did a lot of M&A, and we very much had HR, at least someone who represented the human, the people aspect on the teams. So, Jonathan, first of all, before we start, I want to
Sure.
say here's Alan's contact information. Certainly, I'll be happy to hear from you if you have any questions or want to talk about careers within organizations. But so what happens, Jonathan, if you don't have a plan? And we've got a sense of what we think planning is. It's really kind of knowing what you want and the culture you want to work in, and some sort of ambition to be better at it and to progress both in terms of maybe title, but also money and knowledge. But what happens when you don't have that sort of a plan? You talk always the difference between getting a job and having a career.
Yeah. So that's a great question, because not having a plan generates a lot of emotional responses depending on what's happening. So if you're being downsized and you don't have a plan, you go through these whole grief stages. It's an emotional shock. If you have a plan and you're downsized, it's still a shock, but you can see light at the end of the tunnel because you have some sense of what you'd probably like to go forward and do. But how you set that plan up, and I talk to recent grads, and I talk to a lot of people that are like 0 to 10 years in their careers, and they say, I don't need a plan. I'll just go get another job, which is true. But what I encourage them to do is just understand the terrain in which they're fighting the battle for their career. And we talk often about the war for talent. The truth is, from a candidate's perspective, from a career perspective, that whole battle is reversed. And so what I tell people is, look, the job market has 6 well-defined criteria. We look at them all the time when we look for jobs: location, industry, et cetera. Your career has 3 very different criteria. And even early, you can begin building a great network of advocates for your career. You can begin thinking, what issues do I really care about addressing? And from early in your career, I strongly encourage people, even with your first job, to say to yourself, if I do this, is my family better off? And this generates a crucial part of the discussion, which is, what's a family? And often I talk to young people and say, well, I don't have a family. It's just me. Well, I say, okay, well, you got you, yourself, and I, and you got 3 people at the table at least, or maybe they've got a dog or a goldfish. And as silly as it sounds, it's important to think about, is the family better off? Because it's much more than money. Often it's location, it's hobbies, it's interests, it's other things that people like to do. And thinking about, am I better off, really helps you avoid a false positive. A great job that sounds wonderful, but you have to move to, I don't want to pick on a particular location, but some place that's got terrible weather and you like warm weather. No matter how good the job, if your family's not better off, you need to rethink it.
Well, it's interesting you say that about the family, because one of the things I've learned, I also work, among other things, with CEOs who are in transition. Either I start working with them as a coach, and then something happens and they no longer have that position, or they come to me somewhat desperate because they either see the train coming down, and they're about to get hit by the request for resignation, and inevitably it's the wife who makes the final decisions. You can see it directly. I had a client who literally, he was like a bat out of a cannon. The organization he had been hired to was a big problem, and he wasn't happy, and he didn't trust anybody. And there was after 10 months, a mutual decision for him to resign. 3 months later, he had the job. It had everything, all the hallmarks of what he wanted. And I was floored because he just went for it. And I said, give me one, what was it? Why were you just so intent outside of the obvious? He said, and this, I hope, was facetious. It may not have been. He said, because my wife would have committed suicide if I hadn't gotten a job. And he sounded serious, but, and I have other candidates who I've helped who kind of never quite turn the corner and end up doing this, that, and the other. And it's because the wives have really good jobs and the wives aren't putting any pressure on them to do it. So I find the wives play a huge role. If you're straight and married, tends to be the equation.
Oh, I think family, I think you're absolutely right. And I would respectfully say family has almost no clear definition other than a person's sense that someone else is interested in the outcome of a career change.
Right.
But what I try to work with people on, and you brought up a great point, other people are impacted. In the conversations about, is your family better off, the only positive outcome is a feeling of mutual respect between you and the other people involved. It isn't right or wrong. that becomes a very dangerous trap, because often there isn't a right or wrong, but there is a process of mutual respect. And if you do it right, your family relations can become better as a result of what might seem to be a horrific forced career transition. But if you're careful in how you do it, it can actually turn out to be a positive. That's a whole separate topic about how you maintain a positive mental attitude, though.
Well, actually, Alan sort of brought that up when he said he positions it as not you're losing a job or something's coming to the end.
Great
That
comment.
that you're opening up opportunities. So Alan, again, coming back to the topic of how an organization sees it, are there tension points that arise from an HR point of view when somehow objectives and planning don't align, especially with senior executives?
Most of the time, it really depends on. I have experienced both in that senior management teams, because I was part of them, that whatever was developed by HR or by the team, were acceptable to them because they trusted me. They already saw me in action. They knew I would make good decisions. And I've worked in environments where the core values or the measurements of success were done by some guy who sat in the corner office who was kind of grumpy when he walked in every morning, and you'd get them and you'd have to try to, number one, sit back and try to understand what the hell they had written, what they were talking about. And the rest of the team coming into my office going, what is this? So I would be the one that would go into him and say, look, I'm evaluating this. And if I'm reading this correctly, you tell me, because I'm going to rewrite it. And so I was a little bold, but being in private equity, you couldn't be shy.
Right.
You had to be able to really stand up and tell people what you thought. And, the one thing that companies, they're all talking about it today, is that they're offering this career development within the company. And, for so many years beforehand, they didn't offer anything. You got that book that you could take the $99 seminar on.
Right.
You go for a full day, and I think you got lunch or something. And it was like how to be a better manager. Okay. But there was no action to it, no practice to it.
Right.
And, and now today they're bringing in these high level, consultants, and some of them very good. Some are not making a contribution at all. They're making a check.
No.
So that's it. It's like part of my role and part of what I do when I walk into a company is like, and I meet people, I decide then and there, what are my goals for this company? What do I want to get done? What do I want to achieve on top of whatever they want me to achieve? And then we discuss it all.
Interesting.
And I'm working with a small company now that's going to go from, it's in the marijuana and cannabis business, and they're going to go from 2 labs up to about 11 by the end of next year.
Wow. So you're going to be creating a lot of opportunities.
And I've said, well, I'm willing to help, but it's like, this sounds crazy. But they're well focused. They do spend a lot of time convincing you that they already know it.
Mm-hmm.
I go, okay, then you're doomed already.
Right.
So now I'm working with them to help build up the people that will be underneath them to support them to be successful. Because there's nothing worse than as in your career, if you don't have a manager that supports you in moving up or moving out.
Yeah, well, that's usually a sign, I think at least, and I've been very fortunate that I've always felt, when I was in corporate at least, I was moving up and I had very supportive managers. But that's usually a sign that maybe, especially if you're ambitious, maybe you need to go to another organization. But we're coming up to the last 5 or 10 minutes. I just wanted to also say, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. I am a CEO and executive coach, and I do leadership development. So, you guys do mentoring, coaching. You work with quite, especially you, Jonathan. What advice would you give for someone sort of mid-career, say 35 to 40, when they're about to hit the fast track, if you will, or
Oh yeah.
or become senior? What sort of things would you tell them, or what do you tell them?
I think I'd probably build on something Alan mentioned, given his depth of experience. I think he hit on something very important in terms of, do you have advocates inside your current firm? I would encourage anybody at mid-career to do two things very quickly. One is sort of stand back and ask yourself how you got here. Maybe just write a career narrative. What's the story of your career to this point? Don't think a lot about it. Just write it out and have it ready. The second thing is sort of make a list of the people that you think are important to your career. This is not a traditional networking list. This is a list of people that matter to your career, and ask yourself, is that person an advocate for me? And then I would say, pick the people that you know that you would like to be advocates. Think about the issues that they're interested in, that you're interested in, that you have in common, and have what I call issues-based advocacy conversations with senior people in your network that you think would be helpful as you move your career forward, either within your current firm, or in many cases, that network might be outside of your firm. And I would also encourage you, like with a narrative, don't think too much about it. Pick some people you like, have a few conversations, and just begin, building that back and forth conversation, which is, I think, part of what Alan was referring to when he said, you have to think about, where you have support inside the firm. I would say it's support for your career inside and outside your firm, just as a thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. What about you, Alan, from the other side, from a hiring manager, from a recruiter?
Well, from a recruiter, see, for me, I think a recruiter that comes into your life never goes away.
And by that, I mean also internal recruiter.
Yeah, but even internal recruiter, like they're there and available if you need coaching on challenges you may be having.
Mm-hmm.
But like if I were engaged with Jonathan as an executive, I'd kind of expect that we have now established a long-term relationship of growth. So because over time things may change for me, I may change companies. I may go to Jonathan and say, I need coaching on how I do this because I really want to do it, but I'm not, XYZ, I need some assistance. Yeah. And so there's just this long-term relationship that goes on internally and externally. And, I think that it's important to have people that champion you in your career, whether you, really, whether you're happy in there or not. And if you're not, then your biggest thing is what's next? What am I doing next? And yes, we still have to make money. And yes, we still have to pay our bills. But, you do all those things, but then spend most of your time planning what's the next step for you. Right. And you'll get there. You'll find your way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think impact as you get older becomes more important. And of course, the higher up a hierarchy you go, the more impact you will have. All I can say is when I work with senior executives who are about to become CEOs or have become a CEO, world changes pretty dramatically in ways that a lot of people, including myself, were not aware of and not prepared for. So there's also the whole training, development, and so forth of senior executives that for the most part, I can't imagine. I always say CEOs are not born, they're made, because along the way, you have to be aware of the fact that things are going to change with every new company and with every new position, especially if you're going up the ladder. But I want to thank you guys. This has been very, very interesting. I know we could talk for another hour or two, but hopefully our listeners will have found something of use. I don't see any comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. It was a lot of fun. We really ought to do it again.
Oh, we definitely will.
All right.
Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.